our last morning at the Ideas Festival, but I think this is going to be one of the most exciting things that you've seen. I think most of you have probably been at one of our Aspen lectures the last couple of days. Some of you may have even been here last week, and you know that we decided to inaugurate in this, our 10th anniversary year, something different at the festival. Instead of our usual moderated conversation or panel discussion, to invite a small number of extraordinarily distinguished speakers to actually give more of a traditional lecture. We are calling these and branding them, and we'll be distributing them as Aspen Lectures. They have been terrific, and today will undoubtedly be terrific as well. When we decided to do this, actually the very first topic I thought that we should incorporate is something about Shakespeare. This, as most of you of course know, is the 450th anniversary of the birth of William Shakespeare. There are activities all around the world in celebration of it, and I thought it would be very appropriate for us to do something about Shakespeare as well. And then when it came to thinking about whom to ask to do that, it was a fairly easy decision, actually. Marjorie Garber is one of the leading Shakespeare scholars in the world. She's also much more than that. She is the Keenan Professor of English and Visual and Environmental Studies at Harvard. She also is the past chair of the Visual and Environmental Studies Department, chair of the Carpenter Center, former chair of the Dramatic Arts at Harvard. She's written, I think, 17 books, at least 6 of which have been extraordinarily influential books about Shakespeare. Her book, Shakespeare After All, written, I think, almost exactly a decade ago, is still to this day one of the best introductions to Shakespeare there is. She, of course, also writes on many other topics, cultural topics, intellectual topics, literary topics, and I think you will also hear some of that extraordinary breadth reflected in her comments this morning, and her lecture is entitled Occupy Shakespeare. Marjorie Garber.
Thank you, Elliot, for that very kind and generous introduction, and good morning, Shakespeareans. What I have to say this morning will, I think, tie in with a great deal that's been discussed over the last several days about the arts, about the culture and values, about the university, about storytelling, about creativity, and especially about the question of whether the humanities have a future. Spoiler alert, I think they do. My talk this morning is in 7 brief parts. First part is called Occupational Hazards. Over the last few years, Occupy movements pressing for greater equality and access to resources have swept the globe. Inevitably, reverberations have reached the worlds of Shakespeare. So a spokesman for Occupy Stratford-upon-Avon claimed that Shakespeare would be good for the movement, forging bonds across classes. The Occupy movement would strengthen itself if it realized that its concerns were shared by Shakespeare, and if it looked for ways of using this state of affairs to its advantage. Public readings of Shakespeare plays could be organized within the Occupy camps, for example, and protesters could make contact with people at theaters and at Shakespearean institutions to see if links could be forged. So Occupy and Shakespeare. Ralph Fiennes, who starred in a film of Coriolanus, noted that his character would have deplored protests like this as a threat to civil order. The right-wing media have taken quite a reactionary attitude to the protests, said Fiennes, saying that the Occupy movement is a blight on the city. And I'm sure that's how Coriolanus would feel too. I think he's right. Occupy Shakespeare. In 2011, the American Dialect Society voted to make Occupy the word of the year, defeating contenders like Tebowing, 99%, and the acronym FOMO, F-O-M-O, for fear of missing out. That is, anxiety over being inundated by the information on social media. The chair of the Dialect Society's New Words Committee was very quick to acknowledge that Occupy was in fact a very old word, but he noted that over the course of just a few months, it took on another life, and it moved in new and unexpected directions. when a column on this topic appeared in The Guardian, written by an after-dinner speaker whose Occupy joke had fallen flat, it elicited email commentary from all over the political map, including this one. Two things you cannot make fun of, and there are those who keep trying: Shakespeare and Occupy. Now, the word occupy was pretty much avoided during the 17th and 18th centuries because it had come to mean have sex with. As Ben Jonson complains, many out of their own obscene apprehensions refused proper and fit words as occupy, nature, and the like. They had become dirty words. Shakespeare uses occupy only twice, once in some bawdy remarks by Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet. I was come to the whole depth of my tale and meant indeed to occupy the argument no longer. And the second time by the prostitute doll Tearsheet in Henry IV, Part 2. God's light, these villains will make the word as odious as the word occupy, which was an excellent good word before it was ill-sorted. So the odious sense or slang sense of occupy in the Renaissance was connected to the question of ownership or personal property, the making common of a private place. So a soldier in Christopher Marlowe's Massacre at Paris joked broadly about the crossover between real property, real estate, and sexual property. You, sir, that dare make the Duke a cuckold and use a counterfeit key to his privy chamber door. You till the ground that he himself should occupy, which is his own free land. In other words, you're having an affair with the Duchess. My title, Occupy Shakespeare, is not meant as a veiled 17th century sexual reference, nor yet is it meant in the modern way as its converse, an expletive of condemnation or dismissal. Rather, it's a shorthand way of invoking the questions of habitation, entitlement, and possession, as these affect the relationship between Shakespeare and the humanities. Who's Shakespeare? Who's humanities? It's far from clear at any given moment who is the 1% and who is the 99%. Who is entitled? Who has access and ownership? Who is powerless or disenfranchised? The story I have to tell this morning is the story of a double transformation in which Shakespeare, once not even part of the academic humanities, became increasingly central to them. Meantime, the humanities, once largely defined as the study of the classics, literature, art, music, and philosophy, have expanded into aspects of the sciences, the social sciences, and the professions. There are now thriving programs like medical humanities, law and humanities, business and humanities, humanities and justice across the country and across the world. And in all of these programs, Shakespeare is a key player, cited as an example, as a case study, as an epigraph, as a syndrome, or as the occasion for a moot court. Which is the inside and which is the outside? Is Shakespeare in the humanities, or is the humanities in Shakespeare? Now, one way of visualizing this conundrum might be to construct something like a Venn diagram. Venn diagrams, as you know, mark patterns of overlap, exclusion, inclusion, and identity. So, for example, at a certain moment in the past, the area of overlap between Shakespeare and the humanities occurred in the uses of passages from Shakespeare's plays to teach rhetoric or philology taken out of context and just used as blocks of text, even though Shakespeare wasn't otherwise at all part of the humanities curriculum. People didn't read the plays. Here the two circles intersect, and the common area is a small part of the whole. By contrast, today, when for many students choosing electives in college, Shakespeare is the humanities, the two circles might completely overlap like a total eclipse. Take Shakespeare's the only humanities course you take. But no sooner do we contemplate the Venn diagram as a model than we can realize that Shakespeare has anticipated this question and has offered a series of such diagrams himself in coded textual form, as I'm about to show you. As will be instantly clear from what you see on the screen, these diagrams illustrate some propositions in the plays. One may smile and be a villain. To be or not to be. The portrait of a blinking idiot. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. The wheel is come full circle. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. More in sorrow than in anger. Though this be madness, there is method in it. Is Shakespeare in the humanities, or is the humanities in Shakespeare? Clearly, the answer to both questions today is yes. Instead of a Venn diagram, a better visual model might be a Mobius strip, in which the inside and the outside are one continuous plane. Now here is a Shakespeare-themed example, a bracelet on sale at, among other places, the gift shop of the Folger Shakespeare Library, bearing a familiar quotation from Sonnet 116. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. Now I want you to notice how much text can fit on a slim silver bracelet when it's twisted into this ingenious shape. Presumably the symbolic point here is that two can be one. In this case, that the two sides of the bracelet, the inside and the outside, are really one. Part 2. List, list, oh list. An epigraph from Caliban in The Tempest, remember first to possess his books. How interimplicated are Shakespeare and the humanities? In order to get an approximate and highly unofficial sense of this, I decided to look at a listing of books in the Harvard University Library, the titles of which began with Shakespeare and. I counted approximately 470 titles. Shakespeare and astrology, cognition, drunkenness, moral agency, precious stones, opera, public executions, science, social class, temperance, the classroom, the dance, the fool, the just war tradition, the Red Cross, the supernatural, women, world peace, youth culture. Another entire list could be compiled of the writers with which Shakespeare is coupled by that same useful conjunction and. I want you to bear in mind that these are book titles, not journal articles, not undergraduate student essays. Shakespeare and Byron and Dickens and Berlioz and Joyce and Keats and Machiavelli and Marx and Montaigne and Rembrandt and Sidney and Woodrow Wilson, Shakespeare and Voltaire. Now, when I was typing out this list, my computer spell check function briefly corrected the name of Sir Philip Sidney to its anagram, Disney. Who knew? Maybe this tells us more than we want to know about the current direction of the humanities and the distance between the 16th century and the present. A third list, out of many more possible constructions, conjoins Shakespeare with a local, or not so local, habitation. Shakespeare and classical antiquity, Hawaii, South Africa, Stratford-upon-Avon, Venice, the Mediterranean, the Arab-speaking world. Remember, these are just books, the titles of which begin with the phrase Shakespeare and. They are by no means the sum total of the library's Shakespeare books, or even of books beginning with the word Shakespeare. I might also mention what is perhaps my favorite of these Shakespeare and titles, not one but two works by different authors, one from 1952, another from 1977, each of them called Shakespeare and Myself. I'm thinking of adding a third text to this collection. But wait a second, what about Shakespeare in, rather than and, the humanities? Back I went to the library where another 150 or so titles awaited me. Shakespeare in art, in music, in modern type, in limerick, in love, Shakespeare in the tropics, in Wall Street, in Washington, in the ancient world. Here again, it seems perfectly possible just to rest my case. Shakespeare is the humanities are Shakespeare. And yet there was a time, not too very long ago, when Shakespeare's participation in the humanities was both more uncertain and more unofficial. Part 3, the dark backward and abysm of time. In American colleges and universities, Shakespeare was for many years the equivalent of a club sport, a pleasurable experience of extracurricular reading rather than a field of classroom study. In 1743, for example, the Yale College Library catalog listed Shakespeare among books of diversion. It was in the college classes in rhetoric, in belles lettres, and in philology that Shakespeare could be found, not initially in courses in English literature, which didn't exist. During the period 1785 to 1859, when, according to Andrew Dixon White, English authors were never directly taught in Yale classrooms, Yale students read Hugh Blair's Lectures on Rhetoric and Belles Lettres from cover to cover. And for Blair, a minister and a professor of rhetoric and belles lettres at the University of Edinburgh, Shakespeare provided example after example, not of literary style, not of plot, but of rhetorical and ethical value. Shakespeare an offender against the rules of poetry. Shakespeare as a true painter of human feelings. Shakespeare as a teacher of virtue, and so on. Each statement illustrated with a suitable quotation from the plays. Again, we're not reading the plays, we're just reading chunks of text from the plays. As for philology, here's a typical question posed to his students by Francis A. March of Lafayette College, who was later the president of the American Philological Association and the vice president of the London New Shakespeare Society. Topic for discussion is a single word in the play of Julius Caesar, the first word of the play, spoken by the tribune Flavius. The word is hence. Here's the whole sentence. Hence, home, you idle creatures, get you home. And here are the questions. What is the first clause? What ellipsis? What kind of a clause? Declarative, interrogative, imperative, exclamatory? What does hence combine with? Does it complete or extend the predicate? Why called a pronomial element? How is the genitive ending written in Anglo-Saxon? Rule for the point after hence, that is the punctuation mark. Rule for its capital. Does this make you want to study Shakespeare? This is how Shakespeare is taught in the middle of the 19th century. By the time Henry James attended Harvard Law School for a year in 1862, Harvard had still not accommodated itself to the curricular study of Shakespeare. A student might, James noted, read the literature of our own language privately, but it was not a subject of instruction. In Harvard College's elective course on English, reported Henry James, Professor Child provided an introduction to the reading of Anglo-Saxon and Chaucer. There, so far as English literature was concerned, the college stopped. Now, Professor Child was Francis James Child, who would a few years later introduce what was Harvard's first Shakespeare course in 1876. 1876, first Shakespeare course at Harvard. As late as 1883, James Russell Lowell, the poet, the professor of modern languages at Harvard, could tell the Edinburgh Philosophical Institute that he lamented the absence of formal Shakespeare instruction. While I believe, said Lowell, in the maintenance of classical learning in our universities, I never open my Shakespeare, but I find myself wishing that there might be professorships established for the expounding of his works, as there used to be for those of Dante in Italian. An astounding idea at this time. For those who know no language but their own, there's as much intellectual training to be got from the study of his works, Shakespeare's works, as from that of the works of any, I had almost said all, of the great writers of antiquity. But this is still a radical idea in 1883. Change came, when it did, in the last decades of the 19th century, when departments of English and new innovation were founded in many North American colleges and universities. By the turn of the century, the College Entrance Examination Board and various colleges and universities all specified some knowledge of Shakespeare as among the requirements for entrance. But these requirements often went no further than a rudimentary knowledge of the plots, something that could have been gleaned from a crib or from a summary, indeed from reading Lamb's Tales. And what about Shakespeare and the humanities in Britain? Here, too, the relationship between Shakespeare and the humanities curriculum is of relatively recent date. English only became an official university subject at Oxford in 1894, although the Oxford University Dramatic Society was established 10 years earlier on the condition that it performed only Greek tragedy and Shakespeare, not low genres like revue and farce. There wasn't an English department at Cambridge University until 1919. In Scottish universities, Shakespeare was being taught by the end of the 18th century, though in rhetoric courses rather than in English. But arguably the key figure in the establishment of Shakespeare as central to the humanities curriculum in Britain was A.C. Bradley, whose lectures on Shakespearean tragedy were going to play a key role in changing the way Shakespeare was taught. Bradley had begun as a philosopher. He left Oxford for the University of Liverpool in 1881, where he'd applied for a position in philosophy and political economy. But he found himself 1 year later, in 1882, the first holder of a brand new chair in modern literature and history, a new thing. He moved to Glasgow in 1889 to be a professor of English, and he retired in 1900 at the ripe old age of 49. A year later, however, he was back at Oxford, not this time as a fledgling idealist philosopher, but instead as a professor of poetry, elected for a 5-year term. Bradley's famous book, Shakespearean Tragedy, published in 1904 and dedicated significantly to my students, became the founding text of what the English critic Terence Hawkes called a system of universal education, which has established the study of Shakespeare as its linchpin. We're still there to a certain extent. Through Bradley, wrote Hawkes, philosophy found itself subverted by literature. Together with classics, it sank in terms of broad social influence virtually without trace. English became the huge and continuing success of the academic world, carrying all before it as the requirement for social and professional advancement. So philosophy and classics no longer at the center of the humanities, now it's English, down through the middle at least of the 1980s, because that was then and this is now. Hawkes published his account of the dominance of English studies in 1986, about a century after Bradley's move from philosophy to literature. In 86, English was still going strong. But if Bradley's professional transformation were taking place now, rather than 100 years ago, it would be at least as likely that he'd be transitioning in the other direction, from English to philosophy and political economy, rather than the other way around. In any case, to jump from Bradley's 1904 lectures on Shakespearean tragedy to the 1980s, much less to 2014, is to skip over the period of what might have been Shakespeare's greatest dominance as a cultural humanities marker among the general public. In situating the relationship of Shakespeare to notions of general educated knowledge in this period, it might therefore be useful to quote a well-known and still tendentious remark by C.P. Snow in his 1959 Reed lecture, The Two Cultures. A good many times, said Snow, I have been present at gatherings of people who, by the standards of the traditional culture, are thought highly educated, and who have with considerable gusto been expressing their incredulity at the illiteracy of sciences. Once or twice I've been provoked and have asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold. It was also negative. Yet I was asking something which is about the scientific equivalent of have you read a work of Shakespeare's? Now, Snow's scorn is directed at literary intellectuals who are not literate in science. But his assumption is that reading a work of Shakespeare's is a basic social accomplishment, one routinely expected of people who, by the standards of the traditional culture, are thought highly educated. I wonder how automatic that assumption would be nowadays among elite professionals in the 21st century. In Snow's time, though, Shakespeare was something that educated people read and watched and knew, and this shared knowledge was on quiet but insistent display in a subgenre of fiction that was as popular with scientists and social scientists as it was with literary scholars, and that is the detective novel. Part 4, the Dogberry Scale. A couple of epigraphs to share with you. Few Michael Innes characters will flinch at playing a parlor game, which involves remembering quotations about bells in Shakespeare. And from Hamlet, of course, you would pluck out the heart of my mystery. We hear a good deal these days about humanities indicators. I have my own index for literacy in the conjunction of Shakespeare and the humanities, something that might be called the Detective Story Allusion Tabulation, or the DSAT, otherwise known as the Dogberry Scale. This invaluable scale, named, of course, after Shakespeare's bumbling constable in Much Ado, tracks the casual allusions to Shakespeare's plays in detective fiction from titles to playful exchanges. It's my contention that the writers and readers of classic detective fiction in the mid-century period represent a kind of protected enclave, to be studied in the same way that anthropologists study the populations of remote islands uncontaminated by modern culture, or that linguists once studied Appalachian hollers in quest of the, quotes, Elizabethan English spoken by Shakespeare. A close examination of these documents and their authors can give us something of a sense of the cultural place of Shakespeare then, and point towards some signal differences between then and now. There's something striking about the insistence of Shakespeare references in this rather insular period between the First World War and the Cold War. And of course, it's insular in a literal sense, too, since most of these detective novels are set in England. They're set, in fact, in an England not very far removed from the England so memorably described by T.S. Eliot in his Notes Toward the Definition of Culture of 1948. The term culture, wrote Eliot, includes all the characteristic activities and interests of a people. And then he lists them. Derby Day, Henley Regatta, cows, the 12th of August, a cup final, the dog races, the pin table, the dartboard, Wensleydale cheese, boiled cabbage cut into sections, beetroot in vinegar, 19th century Gothic churches, and the music of Elgar. The reader can make his own list. Now, while you're busily making your own lists on your Aspen Ideas program, let me try to make my case for the whodunit as a template of Shakespeare and the humanities in this period. In the 1930s, the 1940s, and the 1950s, and into the decade of the 60s, it was common for detective story writers to give book titles taken from phrases in Shakespeare. Macbeth and Hamlet were predictably very fertile sources for titles. Look to the Lady, Deed Without a Name, The Pricking Thumb, and Be a Villain. As were Romeo and Juliet, No Friendly Drop, Juliet Dies Twice, and The Merchant of Venice, Ducats in Her Coffin. But there were more arcane, more recondite references as well that only a Shakespeare scholar or a Shakespeare fan would be likely to detect, like the Singing Masons from Henry V, or Death the Sure Physician, which inverts a phrase from Cymbeline. Some of these works are well known to fans of the genre, like Josephine Tey's classic mystery novel about Richard III, The Daughter of Time. The title phrase comes from Francis Bacon's essay of truth. Truth is the daughter of time. Truth will out ultimately. Many of Niall Marsh's mysteries actually are about the theater, including a late novel called Light Thickens, in which the curse of the Scottish play makes itself felt, and an earlier book, Death at the Dolphin, in which the discovery of a glove made by Shakespeare's father for his grandson Hamnet, and marked with the initials HS in a familiar handwriting, inspires a playwright to write a new stage play called The Glove. Edmund Crispin's Love Like Bleeding is about the accidental discovery of old manuscripts that turn out to contain Shakespeare's long-lost play, Love's Labour's Won. But other detective story writers, while not quite mute, inglorious Agatha Christie's, are more lost to time, though they were very popular in their day. Consider just as one example the predictably eccentric sleuth in Glyn Carr's popular series of Welsh climbing mysteries. Sir Abercrombie Luker, known as Filthy Luker to his friends, is a noted Shakespearean actor-manager who is also a mountaineer and a gifted amateur detective, and his fetish is to quote Shakespeare passages at every possible moment. In Death Finds a Foothold, for example, 1961, this pompous, that's what the text calls him, actor-manager makes, by my account, at least 18 different Shakespeare allusions in the first 100 pages. As befits a novel about Welsh mountain climbing, at least one of these allusions is to Cymbeline. My point here is not about the popularity of Shakespeare as a theme for detection, since he wrote plays that had great plots, the heart of any good detective story. He was, in a way, in the business himself. But rather about the ease of reference that makes these allusions, some very familiar, some rather obscure, very recognizable to a certain kind of readership. Shakespeare, to these readers, is a kind of social code. Not so much cultural capital as what might be called a cultural trust fund. Not income to be spent, but a blue chip investment in culture. In Dorothy Sayers Busman's Honeymoon, for example, a rural police superintendent surprises Lord Peter Wimsey by his familiarity with taglines from a wide range of literary classics, and very nimbly fields Wimsey's offhand observation that night's candles are burnt out. He quickly recognizes this as a passage from Romeo and Juliet. The interchange between these two amateur Shakespeare scholars, who come from very different social worlds, is indicative of the bonding role played by shared literary reference at a time before the post-war democratization of university education. These are literary books for literary readers, often in fact written by literary writers writing under pseudonyms. Michael Innes was the pseudonym of J.I.M. Stewart, a literary critic who taught at Leeds and Adelaide and Belfast and Oxford. Amanda Cross was the pseudonym of Columbia University professor Carolyn Heilbrunn. Edmund Crispin was the pseudonym of Bruce Montgomery, a composer and an organ scholar. Nicholas Blake was the pseudonym of poet laureate C.D. Lewis. There's also a set of detective stories written under the name Thomas Kidd, one, of course, of Shakespeare's contemporaries, the pseudonym of the eminent American Shakespearean Alfred Harbidge. Of course, there are still good Shakespeare-themed mystery novels being written and devoured today. But the days when a Shakespeare mystery was like a highbrow crossword puzzle, a cultural sign of educated fellowship, a bonding mechanism for elite readers, these are no longer our days. Today, the Shakespeare recognition game is played with plots and character types, not, or not primarily, through the language of the plays. Part 5, playing tag. The practice of recognizing allusions was for hundreds of years known as capping. To cap a proverb, a quotation, or a verse was to quote alternately in emulation or contest, so as to see who could have the last word. And Shakespeare mentions and illustrates this little game in Henry V, where the competitors are French nobles, and the capping game, like in the same play, the Dauphin's sonnet to his horse, seems to be an example of unmanly time-wasting, of fiddling while Agincourt burns. Orleans says, "Ill will never said well," and Constable says, "I'll cap that proverb with there is flattery and friendship." And Orleans says, "I will take that up with give the devil his due," and Constable applauds him and says, "Well placed, good game." Capping, in this sense, is related to another old practice known as tagging, to furnish a speech or a composition with a verbal tag or tags as quotations. But of course, tag now has other meanings for many contemporary users, computer tag or graffiti tag or hashtag. Shakespeare tags and Shakespeare tagging these days has less to do with the play than with the free-floating cultural reference that a title or a phrase seems to convey, whether or not the user has any actual experience of Shakespeare's work. As, for example, this philological observation by Sarah Palin. Repudiate, misunderestimate, we weed up English is a living language. Shakespeare liked to coin new words too. Got to celebrate it. Shakespeare and Sarah Palin. The Shakespeare who liked to coin words is a cultural legend, an article of faith, as are some of his plots and his characters, however summarily freed from the encumbrances of early modern verse, just like Romeo and Juliet. Consider, for example, the words of Love Story, a song by country pop singer Taylor Swift, first released in 2008, now among the best-selling singles of all time, quintuple platinum. Swift based it on a romance of her own, noting that having had the experience of parental resistance, for the first time I could relate to that Romeo and Juliet situation, where the only people who wanted them to be together were them. In the song, the speaker describes her first sight of her Romeo, and her story then follows Shakespeare's up to a point. They meet at a party, her father tells him to stay away from Juliet, and they sneak out into the garden to be alone together. But the denouement has a distinctly modern twist when he kneels on the ground, pulls out a ring, and proposes to her. Marry me, Juliet, you'll never have to be alone. I love you, and that's all I really know. I talked to your dad, go pick out a white dress. It's a love story, baby. Just say yes. Now, the most indicative thing about this 21st century adaptation of Romeo and Juliet is not the happy ending. Changing Shakespeare's plays to give them happy endings was quite common even in the 17th century. Nahum Tate's King Lear of 1681 kept Cordelia alive and married her off to Edgar at the end of the play. But the fact that the song skips over Shakespeare's language completely and limits its references to the plot is in fact something fairly new. I spun it in the direction of Romeo and Juliet, Taylor Swift told Billboard magazine. Our parents are fighting. I relate to it more as a love that you cannot really elaborate on, a love that maybe society wouldn't accept, or maybe your friends wouldn't accept. It's a bit of an eye-opener to think that Taylor Swift's love story could sell almost 7 million copies, at a time when books and articles on Romeo and Juliet are struggling to be published, and when published circulate in inconceivably smaller numbers. A print run at a university press today might well be under 500 copies. In this cultural economy, which is the 1% and which the 99%? More young fans know Taylor Swift's song by heart than have probably either seen or read Shakespeare's play. As I've mentioned, it's the plot, not the language, that now makes a work recognizably Shakespearean to a modern audience. Whether it's a novel like Jane Smiley's 1,000 Acres, King Lear is an aging Iowa farmer with 3 daughters, or romantic comedies like 10 Things I Hate About You, The Taming of the Shrew in Padua High School, or She's the Man, Twelfth Night set in a boys' boarding school called Illyria. Viola cross-dresses because she wants to play soccer and the girls' team at her own high school has been cut. Inspired by Shakespeare's play, She's the Man opened at number 4 in the North American box office and grossed more than $57 million worldwide. $57 million, which is the 1% and which the 99%. What is the role of Shakespeare's studies in a world that is already Shakespearized? The term Shakespearized was Ralph Waldo Emerson's. The problem is our own. Part 6, the whirligig of time. Now, implicit in my topic this morning seems to be a question like, what's the future for Shakespeare at a time when so much discussion is devoted to the future of the humanities? And as with all such questions, it's first useful to revisit the past. I've discovered that there's one infallible way to predict the future in literary studies. Whatever seems the most abject or outdated area of study will shortly emerge as the next big thing. Sounds like a joke, but it's true. Over the last couple of years, we've seen the return of editing and textual studies, of stage history, of the study of emotion and affect, of biography, of religion, of character criticism, and of the history of ideas. After each of these went out, there were some people, at least, who thought they would never come back. When ideas and concepts return, however, they return with a difference, and often with a new name and new descriptors. They are sometimes unrecognizable. They look like the future rather than the past. And of course, they are the future, not the past. But they do repeat something, a longing, a question, a design, a practice, a grieved or ungrieved loss. The revived interest, for example, in literary biography not only reflects the resurgence of interest in narrative history among historians, it also enables a return to one of the most persistently seductive and most persistently criticized categories in literature, the study of authorial intention or intentionality, because it offers possible connections between personal or historical events and the writing process. There's something to be said, too, for the power of what might be called disciplinary amnesia, the curve of forgetting. You forget something, and so you reinvent it again. At the present time, the field of Shakespeare is enlivened and challenged by the prospect of a number of such renewals or revenants, ghosts from the past, vivid and sometimes surprising returns to the future. In clothing fashions, it's the unexpectedness of the return that gives it the extra pop. Plaid is back, really? And it's no difference with intellectual trends. We're all familiar with approaches that have declared their own revitalization by attaching the word new formalism, new historicism, new criticism. But among the most salient, the most striking critical genres that have recently shown signs of coming back in new forms are some that might surprise you: literary appreciation, belles lettres, and universalism, all of which were left for dead, or worse, left for dormant, not all that long ago. Let me say just a few words about each. At a conference on the state and stakes of literary study held at the National Humanities Center in Raleigh-Durham a few years ago, one panel was dedicated to the question, what changes should we seek in literary study in the next decade? Some of the answers proposed were suggestive not only in themselves, but also in the way they pointed Janus-like both back and forward in the history of the humanities. Instead of critique and argumentation, it was proposed, concepts like appraisal and love should be restored to their previous prominence and good repute. We need to relearn how properly to praise a work, said one speaker. Critique and argumentation were now suspect, as was the hermeneutics of suspicion, very popular in the 80s and 90s. In fact, the criticism heaped on the hermeneutics of suspicion in recent months might remind Shakespeareans yet again of Constable Dogberry or of his yokefellow in equity, Constable Elbow, each of whom reverses the meanings of suspected and respected. Dogberry says suspect instead of respect. Elbow says respect instead of suspect. Dost thou not suspect my place? Dost thou not suspect my years? Says Dogberry. And Elbow says, if ever I was respected with her, or she with me, let not your worship think me the poor duke's officer. The emphasis on words like praise and love for works of literature heralds a renewed interest in what used to be called literary appreciation. Now, of course, it won't be called that now. It might be called, say, literature and aesthetic judgment, or literature and aesthetic experience. And it's going to have different critical and theoretical underpinnings, but the impulse felt across the field of literary studies, not just in Shakespeare, is demonstrably there. Belles lettres, literally fine letters, the literary equivalent of beaux-arts, is a term that was in the past sometimes understood to mean the humanities in totality, and sometimes understood as the equivalent of literature. Once a term of honor, as I mentioned, in the 18th century, Hugh Blair was professor of rhetoric and belles lettres at Edinburgh. Belles lettres today, says the Oxford English Dictionary, is generally applied, when used at all, to the lighter branches of literature or the aesthetics of literary study. But sans its French name and its mixed history, this practice is alive and well in the booming fields of creative nonfiction, literary journalism, and the personal essay, all huge on campuses and in the press. I think we can expect this trend to continue as professors and students seek a wider readership of newspapers, general interest magazines, and blogs, while journalists and politicians connect with Shakespeare as one of the very few authors who is neither too high nor too low to be mentioned. In the modern media, Shakespeare, as perhaps his portraits might have portended, has become a talking head. But the most profound shift, maybe across many aspects of Shakespeare and the humanities, is the turn or the return to universalism. Since Ben Jonson's famous assertion that Shakespeare was not of an age but for all time, said right after Shakespeare's death, admirers and scholars have maintained that Shakespeare's appeal and cultural power are not restricted to a specific time, place, or audience, but in fact transcend the local to become universal. Attention to the particular emerged over the last several decades as a crucial corrective to what was then considered an overly coercive universal Western civilization view, working rather than global view. Working with paradigms drawn, therefore, from anthropology and sociology and cultural history and world history, literary scholars honed in with very great success on categories like race, class, gender, sexuality, nation, and identity. And that work has informed the Shakespeare that we teach in the classroom and that we see on the stage. Still, the time of the universal seems perhaps to be at hand again. After so much good work on the specific and the local, putting in question the viability of the universal, the pendulum is now recently swung back in the other direction. Global Shakespeare is both global and local, and also universal in a different sense, since its videos and performances are increasingly available online. The renewed discourse of love, from agape to caritas, is another universalizing move. But the strongest claims for a new universalism in intellectual life are coming these days not from theater or philosophy, but from neuroscience. Placing the emphasis on the brain rather than on behavior seems to get past the problem of cultural difference that led to a questioning of the old universal humanism. Cognitive theory, evolutionary psychology, and theory of mind seem to offer an alliance of literary study with hard science, while establishing the universal at the level of biology rather than of culture. New sources of evidence, in quotation marks, are offered, supporting or seeming to support a familiar hypothesis that we are all the same. In fact, the pronoun we is back in style if it was ever out of it. Just as Taylor Swift cited Romeo and Juliet, contemporary sociobiologists or evolutionary psychologists cite Shakespeare plays or characters to reinforce their arguments about what is inbred, they think, in human nature. When evolutionary psychologist David Buss, the author of several works on the strategies of human mating, published a book on the evolutionary value of sexual jealousy, he called one long chapter The Othello Syndrome. Now, what else is back looking like new? How about the analysis of Shakespeare plays with the use of diagrams and charts? Here's an eye-catching example from Professor Franco Moretti's literary lab somewhere. We should have an example, diagramming what he calls distant reading and what some of his colleagues at the lab call macro-analysis, on the analogy of macroeconomics, the use of quantitative evidence and network theory to study literary texts. In this case, it's used to trace networks of character interactions in Hamlet. The point of this long sketch is that more people talk to Hamlet than to anybody else in the play. I'm showing you one of Moretti's diagrams here, but in fact there are 31 diagrams and charts in his Hamlet essay. Now, comparisons, Shakespeare says, are odorous. But let's try an analogy with a much earlier set of Shakespeare diagrams, those created by Carolyn Spurgeon for her 1935 book, Shakespeare's Imagery and What It Tells Us. Spurgeon, the first female university professor in London, the second in England, and the first to be involved in English literature, was a Chaucerian by training. But her book on Shakespeare's imagery was and remains a pioneering classic. Its evidence has never perhaps been more timely than now, when stylistic analyses are being used to prove and to disprove allegations about Shakespeare's authorship. Spurgeon's book contains 7 beautiful charts, hand-colored, of sea images, clothing images, color images, gardening images, and more. Carolyn Spurgeon had 2 successive secretaries, that is, she had one secretary at a time, who helped in what she called sorting, checking, counting, classifying, and cross-referencing her card catalog of the images. She had one other assistant to help her in copying and drafting her charts. Franco Moretti's literary lab at Stanford has 25+ affiliated researchers who work collaboratively on every single project. Their hope is to use the methods of science and math to make new observations about literary text. The question is still out as to whether or not this is going to work. Now, here again, we can see one of the larger trends at work. Once identified with approaches that are variously described as analytical or theoretical or speculative, the humanities today are increasingly intrigued by data collection and data mining, by quantitative analysis, and by other tools of the sciences and the social sciences. This leap forward also returns us to the moment in Shakespeare's time before the humanities were split off from the other sciences, when the word science, in fact, meant simply knowledge. And thus the whirligig of time brings in its revenges. Part 7, the last part, occupy the humanities. Hic et ubique, here and everywhere, says Hamlet to the ghost, then we'll shift our ground. And from Love's Labour's Lost, let us devise some entertainment for them in their tents. Occupy the humanities. At about the same time that a movie called Anonymous tried to prove that Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare, a digital activism collective called Anonymous allied itself with the Occupy movement. Many of the Occupy Wall Street protesters in New York's Zuccotti Park wore the Guy Fawkes mask associated with Anonymous. The Anonymous group described themselves as hacktivists and their activities as hacktivism. But today we're dealing with what might be called shacktivism, the intervention of Shakespeare and Shakespeare studies in the humanities and in intellectual life. Half a century ago, Shakespeare studies seemed securely situated within the traditional humanities, anchoring and drawing students to English departments and to the then flourishing English majors across the country. But now, or perhaps I should say, and now, at a time when English majors have diminished in number, though not in ardor, Shakespeare and Shakespeare studies are participants in the reshaping of what we might perhaps call the big humanities, the humanities without borders, a humanities that includes aspects of science and social science and computing and, signally, the arts. Ownership of Shakespeare has passed or been expanded in the past century from scholarly generalists and lay enthusiasts at the beginning of the 20th century to scholarly specialists in the middle of the century and up to the end of the 20th centuries, and now really to the public humanities as well, including the media and popular culture. Shakespeare today is a public intellectual, and he's also the cause of public intellectualism in others. Shakespeare in the media or in the corridors of power can feel a long way away from Shakespeare in the halls of academe. The 1% in terms of education and professional training are not necessarily the 1% in terms of influence. Control over how Shakespeare is adapted, filmed, screened, sung, quoted, tweeted, friended, mashed up, and digitally dispersed often lies elsewhere than in classrooms, books, and academic conferences, no matter how diverse and deep our cultural interests. This is a change with real consequences, both for Shakespeare and for the humanities, and also for us who live and practice both. Shakespeare is not only an idea, he or it is a big idea. The opportunity is here and now for Shakespeare scholars and teachers and theaters and libraries and readers to help rethink the role of the humanities, to unsettle settled notions about the now conventional academic division into the humanities, the social sciences, science, and engineering, as well as, very importantly, the eroding boundaries between secondary school and college, between college and professional school, between academia and the world or real life. We should seize as many of these chances as we can, working in collaboration with other institutions, with other disciplines, with other practices, and with each other. To cite a term made popular by the Occupy movement, Shakespeare, whether produced or read or cited, is a kind of human microphone, repeated and repeating, voiced and revoiced, always rippling out to new audiences, both global and local. If we take this opportunity seriously, and I think we should and we must, Shakespeare, the institution, the idea, the brand, the author, and the works, can take the lead in trying to bring about much-needed changes, both in how and what we teach, and in understanding why the humanities, the big humanities, the post-humanities humanities, are a necessity rather than a luxury, in hard times, in good times, in troubled times, and most especially in these times. Thank you.
We have time for questions because this is all being taped. We have to wait for the microphone, so if you have questions, we still have about 10 minutes. Right here.
I came in late, so forgive me if I'm redundant here. I'm just wondering, is there a database where we can look for these examples of Shakespeare in contemporary culture and life and literature? Is there some place we can find that easily? Because this is fascinating. It's so much fun to hear about Taylor Swift bringing this back up and all the other great examples you gave.
I'm sure there are people combining databases of this kind, and in fact, the interest in data is such and the interest in Shakespeare and popular culture is such that it's sure to be done. But surely it's more fun to experience it ourselves. If you pick up your daily newspaper, I picked up my New York Times this morning, and I immediately saw a Shakespeare reference. There's no day when I don't find a Shakespeare reference somewhere in the editorial columns of the Times. We find advertising all over the place. I saw an ad for airline seating, to be or not to be, that is the question. And much pop music. If I'd had more time, I would have talked about many more pop songs that incorporate Shakespeare in some way or another. There's a song, the refrain of which is, "Do you love Shakespeare?" That is the identifying thing, that's the Match.com thing that brings them together, is "Do you love Shakespeare?" So I think there are databases, I can't cite one to you, but I think that it's something that is growing every single day.
It's me again, sorry.
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
I just started reading a book called Will in the World. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
I don't know if you mentioned that or not, but I'm just fascinated about Shakespeare's actual life as they're trying to reconstruct how he actually lived?
There have been 4 or 5, that's one, there have been 4 or 5 very good recent biographies of Shakespeare. And they have a couple of things in common. One is that they dispel the myth, which was a really myth created out of 19th century Romanticism, that we don't know very much about Shakespeare's life. In fact, we know a ton about Shakespeare's life. We know a lot about his real estate transactions. He made a lot of money in the theater. He was the most successful theater manager of his time. He made so much money he could go back to Stratford and buy the second biggest house in Stratford, New Place. He worked collaboratively, as did all writers in this period. It was more like putting together a film script than anything else. That they'd say, something's wrong with Act 3, only they didn't call it Act 3. Something's wrong with this part of the play. Can you fix it, please, because it's got to be on the boards. We know a lot more about Shakespeare as a working playwright than had been previously thought, when people wanted him to be a kind of visionary loner warbling his native wood notes wild. Some of these biographies tend to speculate about what it was that Shakespeare thought or did, or what his relationships with his wife were. There's the famous fact in his will that he leaves his second best bed to his wife. And I've written actually a little essay on this question because so many different people have thought, well, it's because he didn't love her anymore. No, the second best bed was the bed they slept in. The best bed was kept for guests in the house. It was a sign of his affection for her, and so forth. So all of these things can be interpreted and reinterpreted. What's very significant, I think, and I mentioned it very briefly, is that there has been a return to an interest in Shakespearean biography. And really 4 or 5 quite good ones have been published in the last 10 or 15 years and are worth looking at.
I sense 2 different dynamics in the way you're thinking about Shakespeare. One, as you mentioned, the tendency of literary scholarship in the humanities to sort of rediscover things that are out of fashion, and there's a constant churn and renewal of interest. But then you're very wry and somewhat detached about the things like Taylor Swift and whether or not there's a kind of decline in the actual knowledge of Shakespeare. And I'm wondering if you have any concerns about whether Shakespeare's ultimate trajectory will be rather more like Latin, where there's just a smaller and smaller number of little taglines that are held by us and exchanged, rather than a real sort of deeper possession and discussion and knowledge of the work.
Well, I have good news about Latin, that Latin majors are increasing in the university. So it may take a long time for these things to come back. And let me say, first of all, that I think any reference to Shakespeare, any citations of Shakespeare, any quotations or misquotations of Shakespeare are a very good thing for culture and for Shakespeare studies. Any reproduction of the plays or adaptation of the plays, I think these are all wonderful and interesting. I think for me, the language of the plays is paramount, and so when the language disappears and the plays become shorthand plots, something is lost, as happens in a ballet as well as in a pop song. But it keeps the notion of that play alive as a kind of descriptor for and a kind of the basic place where we understand young human love. I think that people are going to Shakespeare in the Park. In the summertime, students are taking Shakespeare courses all the time. The Mark Rylance productions on Broadway sold out and were enormously popular. I don't think we have a crisis in Shakespeare studies at the present time. But I think that there is a separation between the pop appropriation of Shakespeare and the reading of the works. But I think that nothing is forever, and my guess is that sometime Taylor Swift, when she has a moment, might pick up a copy of Romeo and Juliet. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that sequence. I think that if we enter into the world of Shakespeare through pop music and then are intrigued by it and want to go back and look at the text or go to a production or something like that, that is as good an entry as experiencing it first in the lecture classroom and then going out into the world. I think any entry that we have is a good one.
Is it on? Yes. I'm particularly interested in this. I'm one of the 2 playwrights down here commissioned to write a play out of the big ideas, and actually I've written a screenplay about a woman who suffered from selective mutism, who then begins to communicate only through the language of Shakespeare, and it's a feature film that is shooting in September, and so I'm particularly interested by the take on all the various riffs on Shakespeare. But and in a sense you've sort of half answered my question, which was how it seems to me that the language, which is the great glory of Shakespeare in many respects, is often the chief blockage point for people coming into Shakespeare when trying to teach Shakespeare to people these days, and that these popularizations through story and plot and character and the problems that the characters are facing are an excellent opening point into what then turns out to be an incredibly contemporary psychology in Shakespeare, and that perhaps that's the way to let people into Shakespeare. I was just wondering if you could speak to that as a obviously a specialist.
Let me say a couple of things about that. One, I certainly agree with that. One of the brilliant things about the Shakespeare corpus and about the Shakespeare plays is that they seem always to be speaking to the present moment. They never seem to be historians can well situate them vis-a-vis the gunpowder plot or Elizabethan politics, but they always seem to be like the portrait with the eyes following you around the room. Every generation and every nationality and every region of the world thinks of Shakespeare as their Shakespeare, as a Shakespeare that speaks directly to them. One way, so I agree that popularizations and so forth, any way in is a good way in, but the other way is, believe it or not, memorization. When I teach a big Shakespeare lecture course, I ask my students to memorize 20 lines of the plays. I tell them that they can pick any 20 lines, and that I want them to be able to recite them either to a small section of the class or to me in office hours or something like that. And I tell them, and I believe that this is true, that long after they forget what I have said in the class, they're going to remember these lines. And actually, I spoke to the 60th reunion class at Harvard, whom I did not teach. They had some memorization, and they could recite all those years ago, from all those years ago, their lines of poetry. There's something about owning the poetry and being able to speak it from inside and understanding how the rhythms of the language work and how the syntax works that opens up the reading of all of Shakespeare to you. And I can also say that I have heard student recitations of these lines that have taught me things about the lines that I did not know before. I'll never forget a young man reading Cassius or reciting Cassius angrily about Caesar, and this man has now become a god. And I thought, wow, that really taught me something, some passionate thing that I didn't see in those lines before. So amateur Shakespeare, memorization of Shakespeare. Language is not frightening. It's our language. Language is not frightening. It's just a matter of getting people to understand that and to relax into its rhythms. And I should say also, I said this the other day to another group, that I ask my students to read the play twice, rather than to read criticism by me or anybody else initially, because the first time through you can only kind of get the plots and the characters, who after all is Worcester and the Duke of Kent and so forth. Second time through, you can get the rhythms of the language and the wonderful design of the scenes in the plays that is part of the genius of Shakespeare. So I think more exposure works better. But your screenplay sounds wonderful, actually.
Could you speak to the evolution of the history of the question of whether there was Shakespeare or Shakespeare was somebody else, and also the question of why that's important? Why does that seem so important culturally?
Okay, I'm happy to speak to it. I should say that I'm one of the few, quotes, Shakespeareans whom Oxfordians will speak to, because I very early on published a book called Shakespeare's Ghostwriters that has an essay by that title that sort of talks about how various attributions to claims to writing Shakespeare have been made over the years, and why it seems to me that it's the plays and not the history of the author, not the biography, that is for me the key thing. This is very shortly after Shakespeare's death, rumors began to circulate that Shakespeare wasn't the author of the plays. Queen Elizabeth was the author of the plays. Play texts in this period are low literature. They're pulp fiction. They're not allowed in the libraries. Thomas Bodley, who designed the Bodleian Library, said, no play texts in my library. They're baggage books. They're riffraff. No. So we have to understand that for us, this is high culture. This is trash and doesn't belong in it's not literature. It's throwaway stuff. And so nobles and royals do not write for the public stage. They go to the public stage, but they don't write for the public stage, at least under their own names. So two things were claimed about Shakespeare, based upon the fact that his father was the mayor of Stratford. He wasn't a noble. How did he know so much about the nobility? How did he know so much about politics? So the 19th century decided it was really Francis Bacon who wrote the plays, because Francis Bacon was a chancellor and knew a lot about politics. But there have always been 20 or 30 names, not only these two that circulate. 20th century, 21st century likes the Earl of Oxford, partly because there is a lineal descendant of the Earl of Oxford who is alive and kicking and gives lectures. And so if you want to be in the company of Shakespeare's DNA, you can go and listen to him speak. And for many people, this is a numinous and exciting experience. But the part of the reason for these claims is what was an underestimation of the learnedness of the author William Shakespeare. A refusal to bother to look at the curriculum of the Shakespeare Grammar School, where he knew more Latin and some Greek than most of us know, where the classical humanities curriculum that he learned was actually a very serious curriculum. There's no reason to think that he couldn't write about Italy without visiting Italy. I'm sure many of us write about places that we don't visit. So partly it's a kind of devaluation of the historical Shakespeare. But partly, it's, and this is, writers, for example, Dickens says, the life of Shakespeare is a fine mystery, and I tremble every day lest something should turn up. And Keats says, Shakespeare is the only biographer of Shakespeare. The authors don't want there to be a person who wrote Shakespeare. They want it to be a kind of spirit in the world. So that there's a kind of collusion between this kind of idea of Shakespeare as a universal genius, as a kind of presiding figure who is the genius of literature, and this historical claim that in fact William Shakespeare didn't know enough to write about the things that he wrote about. To me, again, the important thing is that I see no reason to think that the historical William Shakespeare did not write the plays. So that's my fallback position. But should it be discovered tomorrow that in fact Queen Elizabeth wrote the plays, I would say that would be very interesting. Okay. Okay. Good. Good. Is this the right genre?